Hello, and welcome back to Box Popcast, the weekly pseudo-academic roundtable of pop culture analysis with drinking and swearing. My name is Christopher Maverick, but you can call me Mav, and I am once again here with my co-host, Wayne Wise. How's it going, Wayne?
Okay, how about you, Mav?
I'm doing crappy. I just screwed up my computer like half an hour before we went on the air. Broke my keyboard. I'm not doing well. If anybody has an R key for the most recent revision of MacBook Pro that they don't want, and they can just mail me the R key, I would really appreciate it.
Just the R key, okay.
Yeah, because it broke off and I cannot find it. So, and it's also going to be very hard to finish typing a dissertation without using the letter R. So
you're just not trying hard enough.
See, you can't say most of the words in that sentence. It really sucks. So anyway, that's how my day's going. How's yours?
Nothing nearly that tragic. Although we've redefined tragic in the era of the pandemic. So
yeah. Well, not a pandemic show this time.
What?
No, we're going to do something completely different. We're going to dispense with like all the usual like craziness that we do when we're opening the show, because we've got a full show. We've got several guests, and we're going to do something crazy. It's a syllabus show. We've done these before.
Hooray!
So for people who have not heard our syllabus shows before, every once in a while we like to do a special show where we say, what would we do if we were teaching a class on, and then insert pop culture concept here. So we did one where we did a class that was just sort of an upper level class on comics. And then we did one that was like an entry level class on monsters. And now we thought, let's do one where rather than doing just comics, we're going to do very specifically a very specific comic or set of comics or comic related material, because it might be movies, could be anything. We're going to do the X-Men.
Because that's not a broad topic.
No, it's not. It'll be fine. This will be really easy.
This will be fine.
Oh yeah. Since we're going to do this, like all the other syllabus shows, we tried to invite a full panel of experts from various walks of life. But everyone on the show today has taught comics in some capacity on the university level. So I'm going to go down the list. The first person returning to the show, you've only been on once before, but this is Caitlin, a friend of mine, colleague of mine at Duquesne, at school that I'm at. So, hey, Caitlin.
Hi, Mav.
Welcome back.
Caitlin. Welcome back.
Hello. Hi, Wayne. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And Caitlin, you've read a superhero comic or two?
Yeah, I've read a couple in my day.
So that's why you're here. And real briefly for everybody, just let everybody know what you do at Duquesne.
Yeah, so I specialize in representation of Black culture. And so how comics and graphic novels kind of fit in that is I try to think about like the ways in which Blackness is visually represented, more specifically Black female superheroes, and how they've emerged over time in chronology, and like what those representations have looked like.
So that will hopefully be relevant here.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
I think so.
I love me some Storm. I love it.
And next we have Anna, who's been on the show before as well. Hey, Anna, welcome back.
Hello.
Anna.
Thanks for having me again.
Yeah. And you've also read at least 2 or 3 comics in your life.
Yeah, at least 2 or 3, and like most Excalibur issues about 10 times.
That's more than me, and that's sad. I love Excalibur. I actually think it's you're referring to the Claremont and Davis run on Excalibur, the classic Excalibur, which I thought was a great book that doesn't get a lot of play anymore. So I assume you're going to be mentioning some of them.
That's why I'm here repping it. But yeah, I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Brock University. I kind of specialize in comics and pop culture and superhero stuff. I'm teaching a superheroes course right now, and I have got a really fun anthology coming out that just was available for pre-order today called Supersex, Sexuality, Fantasy, and the Superhero. So I do a lot of stuff about representation of sexuality and gender, hence my interest in X-Men, which has a lot of interesting things to say about all of those things.
I wonder if we can like trick people into just ordering lots of the books by just pretending it's just straight up porn and not like academic criticism.
It talks about porn, and there are penises in it. So I mean, maybe that's a selling point.
I did that.
I think the 5th page is Batman's penis. So just
that's
a selling point, right?
When I taught my comics class at Duquesne, I literally called it Sex, Violence, and Comics, because I knew that if I called it gender violence in comics, not as many people would show up. So I just like made them it's like, you're here already now, sucker. You know. And finally, we have returning. He's been a while. Chris Gavler is another scholar friend of ours. Hey, Chris, welcome back.
Thank you. It's very good to be back.
And Chris, you've read, and this is scary, at least 4 comic books in your life.
Possibly 5, but I tend to skim. I actually focus. I'm not kidding. Look at the pictures. I tend not to read the words.
readings for chumps, you know. That's why we do this.
That's why we're into comics.
Chris, you are a professor at
Washington and Lee University.
Yeah. And you also have several books out on comics. We were talking about before the show.
I do. I have 3 out and 2 forthcoming.
Mm-hmm. So this should be exciting. Everyone here has read X-Men. I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that we were supposed to have another guest, Andrew DeMond. Is this his last name, Anna?
Yeah, Andrew DeMond. Yeah, it's close enough.
And Andrew was having technical difficulties and couldn't join us for the show, but I promised I'd pimp his website project, his Twitter project. Andrew, if you follow the Claremont Run on Twitter, that's him. And he's a colleague of Anna's and her co-host on her podcast. Can you just tell people on his behalf what the Claremont Project is? Because people will see why it would have been super relevant. Yeah,
certainly can. Yeah, he's doing it's like a publicly funded, like the big National Research Institute in Canada is funding it. It's a study of Chris Claremont's 16-year run on Uncanny X-Men. He's done a lot of really great archival research. He's interviewed Claremont. He's reviewed his papers at Columbia University. Wow. And it's a real public outreach project as well. So he's doing a lot of sort of video discussions on YouTube, and the Twitter account has been amazing, where he's just really making academic analysis of X-Men digestible to a really wide audience. And his Twitter account has gotten super popular. For an academic account about X-Men to have thousands of followers is pretty good. Yeah. So he's getting up there.
Yeah, which is kind of why we wanted him on the show today, but the technology wouldn't work.
He's one of the foremost experts, and I'm so sad that he's not here.
Oh.
Yeah, I know.
We'll do a follow up because I'm sure we can talk about X-Men again.
Yeah, I wasn't ready, but the foremost experts. I should have done this. Yeah, but I missed it. I'll have to save that for next time. But anyway, we've got a lot of show today, so we're gonna hit the ground running. If you've heard the syllabus shows before, the way we do this is we come into this show with no plan other than what if we were going to teach a course on this thing. Chris, you were on the very first one we did. You were on the comics one we did, and what we'll do is, we all have different ideas of what goes into a course, even though we've all taught them. We all have different agendas. We don't know what the course is going to be. We don't know what's on each other's lists yet. We didn't share them ahead of time. So we're going to try and figure out what the goals of this course would be, and then kind of round table around some suggestions. And then we're going to whittle it down to 10-ish, 10 to 12 books that, you could go out and read in order to sort of learn something about X-Men. What that something is what we're going to decide in the next few minutes. So, so that's what we're going to do. It should be exciting. It should be fun. What's this course about?
X-Men.
Okay, done. Thank you for joining us, everybody. Well, X-Men's a big topic. It's a comic that's been going on for when's the first issue?
63, I think. 60.
Yeah, so for almost 60 years, 50 something years, 57. I don't do math anymore.
Come on, you're like a mathematician, are you not?
I'm a computer programmer. I don't do that anymore. Yeah, so there's a lot of X-Men out there. There's a lot to sort of talk about.
And maybe we should start out just for those who don't know, which I don't know anybody who'd be listening to this podcast who doesn't. What are the X-Men, Mav? What's the basic premise of the X-Men?
The X-Men are in its first incarnation, the X-Men are a group of superhuman teenagers who have powers for no other reason than that they were born with them. They are mutants for, Stan Lee got tired of coming up with origin stories. So he just said, what if people had their genes mutated by atomic energy? So they just had kids who were just born with powers, and go. Now I don't have to explain anything ever again because Stan was lazy, and that's and that's where the X-Men came from. And he called them mutants, and his publisher said, "What's a mutant?" And he's like, and Stan explained it, and he said, "No one's going to know what that is." So Stan said, "What if we call them X-Men for their extra powers?" And the publisher was like, "I love it." And Stan's like, "Perfect." And no one ever thought about the fact that and they thought that no one's going to understand what that means anyway, but it was too late because they were already publishing it. So the original classic X-Men team was Professor X was their leader, and it had Cyclops, Iceman, Jean Grey, who called herself Marvel Girl at that time, but it's a whole big confusing thing that we're not going to get into, Angel, and the Beast. And then since that time, they've had approximately 14 billion other members that have floated into and out of the team. Probably the most famous of which is Wolverine. If you've seen the superhero movie and it had Hugh Jackman in it, that's an X-Men movie. That's who the X-Men are.
Good job.
Yeah, that's my quick summary.
Well, I mean, other than to maybe, because we're going to talk presumably about the significance of the mutant metaphor, but I mean, in terms of that being sort of one of the unique, because I mean, even in that original like Lee Kirby version of the X-Men, sort of the idea that they're uniquely persecuted because they're born with these powers and are the next stage in human evolution becomes very foundational. And it wasn't handled with a lot of sophistication in that original run, but you do have the introduction of the Sentinels and like the government persecuting mutants specifically, and that's sort of their unique niche within that Marvel universe, in which lots of superheroes are persecuted and hated by the public, but the X-Men particularly so.
So they've gone on to be a metaphor for, every social issue that we have encountered since 1963. Depending on the writer.
Any outsider can identify.
Yes. And
absolutely.
And they've been used as a metaphor for race, for gender, for sexuality, for religion. And they,
for
again,
nerds.
For nerds. Or they've had their version of an AIDS crisis. They've had any number of political and social issues that whoever the writer is at that time feels like sort of dumping into the story. Sometimes handled better than other times. And when they don't have anything else to do, there's just fights and sex and reincarnation. more often than you would think.
Yes.
So that's the X-Men. We'll talk about, and there's also a lot of related properties. There's the movie New Mutants, which for our box office game is on Wayne's schedule. We will talk about other specific areas and runs as they become relevant, because there's way too much for us to get into everything. So that's our quick synopsis, I guess.
Yeah.
And then the fact that X-Men deals with all those issues of representation is why we're arguing you can do a whole course on it, because it's sort of the pinnacle of the superhero genre in terms of some of those themes.
Yes.
Right. So again, what is this course? Is the course on that, or is the course on something else? I don't know.
I was going to say, for a course, maybe our first thing we should come up with is rationale. What's our, on the syllabus, what's the reason for taking this course?
Well, I think with X-Men, one of the things that is most appealing for any demographic is it's this commentary on like the human condition, right? It's not just good versus evil. It shows like how complicated humans can be and like how we handle difference, right? And so I think if we're going to think about like how we construct this course, and especially around representation, that has to be essentially the ethos of the syllabus, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would agree. I don't see how you can teach X-Men and not have representation be like the main through line.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
But I would make a case for it as being a really good text for studying kind of evolutions of genre and long form storytelling, which I know Andrew would have been able to speak to so well if he was here, because that's the basis of his project. But that's one of the things we were talking a little bit before the pod, which I love when I make a reference to a conversation you guys haven't heard. But that X-Men, for as teachable as it is also very unteachable. So like in part because it has this long form storytelling, which is one of the most unique and wonderful things about it, and yet also one of the things that makes it the hardest to teach. So figuring out exactly how you do a course is really hard.
Well, I think teaching comics in general, that's always going to be an issue when you're dealing with the major publishers anyway. They weren't designed to be, here's a story. When you're teaching any of this stuff, you're teaching 80 years worth of quote unquote continuity, and how do you do that? What stories do you pull out? How do you approach, say long form storytelling, but in a long form that I don't know that exists in any other media.
Let's teach War and Peace, but only chapters 12 through 15.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. How do you pull that out? Because essentially what makes comics work and not work is this multiple creators over a course of, say, in the case of the X-Men, 60 years with how many dozens of creators talking about these characters. So as a consistent narrative, it's not.
No.
The fact that it's been going on so long, and I think this is generally true of superhero comics, you have this opportunity for discontinuity, which I think is actually significantly more interesting. There's multiple meanings of representation. In terms of storytelling, obviously the form is visual, and whenever you have a change in artist, that can radically alter the nature of the world. And we tend to think of it more as narratives in literary terms. But if you look at comics, and particularly X-Men comics, as visual art form, some very strange things are happening. And so finding examples of the same characters represented differently by different artists, it sort of, I find this fascinating, but it sort of undermines the idea of a continuous world, in which if characters can look radically different from one issue to the next because a new artist has taken over, what does that say about that world? Is a panel a window into that world, or is it something else?
That's something I would definitely want to teach if I was doing a course that was specifically on X-Men. I mean, I have some of those conversations when I teach a course specifically on superheroes, but being able to focus on sort of one superhero franchise would be so useful that way. Because, I mean, one of my frustrations with a lot of kind of the scholarship that exists on teaching comics is that it will be really focused on teaching those iconic graphic novels, which, like, is frustrating because it's sort of, to me, taking away some of the uniqueness of comics to take that approach. Because, I mean, whether it's mainstream comics or indie comics, because there's so many indie comics that are long running as well that don't work in conventional narrative patterns. So teaching, how you can represent reality in unconventional narrative patterns is like exactly what's so exciting about comics. And then we strip some of that away when we're not teaching it that way and when we're just teaching sort of like chunks in graphic novels, which can be like, there's obviously a ton of value to that approach as well. But like, I am frustrated that, like when I'm reading a book about how to teach comics, and I've read several, it's like often there's no approach offered to how to teach complex seriality because it's just considered almost impossible.
And I think that's certainly one of the things that's developing just as comics academia grows. And that's something that hasn't been dealt with very much in other media. And it's like, the collective we have to figure that out.
And that's what we're doing by trying to come up with an X-Men course.
Yeah, it's always tricky for that reason. As we said on the comic syllabus episode, usually if somebody says they're going to teach comics in a class, what they mean is they're going to teach Watchmen or Persepolis or what they mean is Watchmen, Persepolis, Mouse, Fun Home, or what was the fifth one, Wayne? Do you remember what we said? It was like,
no, I can't remember.
Yeah, I think we said
maybe Jimmy Corrigan, maybe.
Yeah, and it's like, and it's like, and you can leave, if you can leave one of them out, and it's not allowed to be Watchmen. It's pretty much how comics courses go, and it's like, okay,
and I think we've probably all done that, and there's reason for it. There's value to that, but you're right, it completely leaves out so many other things.
Right, and I think X-Men is interesting because it is, one of the most recognizable, but because it's going to be hard because of that issue. So I think one of the first things that we need to, I propose that we assume this class is a 300 or 400 level course. And the reason I'm saying that is because I do not want to, we're presuming anybody who's taking this class has a basic understanding of comics as academia. You've already taken the course that we had before. We're not teaching understanding comics in this class. We're not teaching Watchmen. We're not teaching Persepolis. We're not giving you that basic foundation. We assume that people know how to read comics and know how to analyze comics in order to do this class, because otherwise they're going to be lost by the time they get to the Claremont run.
Yeah.
Are we assuming that this course is only comics?
No, I don't think I don't
thank
think so
God.
because my list is not. So
Okay.
I do think it is very much focused on superheroes, particularly the X-Men, which is not the case for the previous episode that we did on the comic syllabus. We went out of our way to not just do superhero stuff. And I think this is very much not only going to be mostly superhero stuff, it's going to all be related to that one property.
And I think given the influentialness of X-Men, you can make a case that you can teach a superheroes course that's just X-Men.
I think so.
Oh, very.
And I mean, just like you could teach a literature course that is only Shakespeare. You can teach, or only Gertrude Stein. So I think you can do this. I think it is a reasonable assumption to make.
And if we're expanding it into TV and movies and stuff, there's so many other things we can do. I mean, we could have the students watch Mutant X and tell them about how that existed, which could be really interesting.
Okay, so are we focusing on representation, or are we focusing on specific? Like, are we going to, like, I don't know that we need to do just gender representation or just racial representation or anything like that. Because for me, one of the things that's most interesting about the X-Men is that it has been used as a metaphor for so many different types. I wouldn't boil it down to one of the things that people often say about X-Men over the course of its run is, you can look at Professor X and Magneto as analogs of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, which I think is true, but also reductive. But I also don't want to limit it to just that, because I think that saying it's only a racial metaphor sort of limits what has been done with it over a long time.
I think that concept so infuses X-Men just as a running theme throughout the course. If this is about representation, what do you recognize as representation with whatever we decide to read or watch? How do you see that? What is being represented here? How do you interpret that? Just a theme that runs through the whole thing.
Well, I was just going to expand on that and just say, I don't think it's just representation, but what is the gaze in this issue, right? Because you could look at the, uncanny X-Men and say the gaze is obviously, this nuclear 60s focus, but you could look at X-Women and that's a completely sapphic gaze, right? And so I think, not only are the themes of representation happening, but how are we reading into these comics?
Yeah, I mean, fan culture is obviously a big thing that you can talk about with X-Men as well. But I mean, in terms of representation too, and if we're talking about sort of long form storytelling and transmediality, you can look at sort of which types of representation are prioritized as the central aspect of the mutant metaphor in different iterations, right? If we think of race as a really guiding principle of the 70s comics, for instance, into the 1980s, whereas something like, I don't even want to say Bryan Singer's name, but the Bryan Singer films definitely play up play up the queer context of X-Men, and that's become sort of a dominant reading of X-Men in the 21st century. It was always present in the earlier iterations, but it's become much more dominant, I would argue, than the racial metaphors in the current iteration.
I'd like to ask a question along those lines, because I think it's clear that the being a mutant is a metaphor, or rather, it's an open metaphor, obviously open to multiple interpretations. Do you think that Stan Lee, when he introduced the characters, I guess it was 1963, 64, was that, I was going to say his intention, ultimately his intentions don't matter, but I'm still kind of curious about the question. Do you think he intended it to be a metaphor for a range of difference, or do you think that's been taken up by different later creators and sort of retconning that into the original character type?
Stan is so hard to read because, much like the comics, Stan over his career contradicted himself left and right from minute to minute, just in interviews. So I'm not sure he even knows what he intended back then. Certainly in the later years, he knew that he was writing a metaphor for inclusion. I think that in the later years of both writing it, which he didn't do for all that long, Stan's actual timeline for writing and wasn't actually that long, but even narrating or the animated stuff, or his writing about his being the face of Marvel Comics, he certainly knew eventually that that's what they had become, whether he intended it or not. And I don't know, author is dead. I don't know if it matters. Stan actually is dead, but I don't know. I don't know that his intention mattered that much, especially since I'm not sure he even knew what his intention was.
Yeah.
Actually,
I agree.
Yeah.
I think in general he was fairly socially progressive, and that informed a lot of his work. I don't know how conscious it was when he created X-Men, particularly in '63. Is I'm going to create a metaphor for inclusion. I think certainly informed his worldview, and that was probably there on some level, whether conscious or not.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I mean, I was saying before, I mean, the Sentinels get introduced in what, like issue 3 or 5 of original X-Men, so it is really early in the run, and that is unique. Like, I mean, despite the persecution of other Marvel superheroes, especially Spider-Man and the Hulk, like to have the government actually like cracking down on mutants in an organized fashion and like trying to exterminate them does make it a little bit different, and it's hard not to see how there must have been some kind of, I mean, let's not forget Jack Kirby worked on this as well. Like Jack Kirby was in World War II, saw concentration camps. So like, I mean, I don't think you can neglect that context in terms of thinking about X-Men and like the narratives of genocide that so often inform it.
And they're both aware. I mean, Stan and Jack are certainly aware of the civil rights movement unfolding around them, at that time. They're not, I mean, if you look at like Black Panther, I was going to say imperfectly, but they do create Black Panther.
Indeed.
Right.
Yeah.
They're not, I'm not saying, which is not to say, I certainly wouldn't call either of them perfect, but they're aware of the world. Right. And they're aware of the world unfolding around them and trying to address it in a way that, that not necessarily all creators did at that point. So.
Right. And I mean, you got to think about Storm too, right? Like she comes in and, there is no like real explanation of like her presence. You're just she's thrown into the canon and you're just supposed to take it on face value, And so I think, Stan Lee was doing something, I don't want to say revolutionary because I feel like that's a loaded term, but I think that there's something unique there in the sense that he's just like, we need to recognize that representation needs to come in more forms. And to have this like powerful Black woman is just so like nuanced in the sense that like a lot of literature wasn't really giving that attention. So I don't know. That's my 2 cents.
Well, we should note that Stan wouldn't have been involved in the creation of Storm specifically, but I mean, definitely in terms of laying that kind of groundwork.
That'd be Lynn Wein and
Lynn and Dave Cockrum.
But again, and that's the 70s. I mean, Stan's editor-in-chief by then. Actually, he might have even been publisher by then. I think he was only editor-in-chief.
Still involved for sure, but
but it's so. I mean, he's certainly steering the boat. So okay, I think we have a general direction. I mean, maybe
like sort of organized around, like it's X-Men, but it's organized around the mutant metaphor and what that means. Because I mean, if we organize it around metaphor, right, that like allows us to talk about a lot of storytelling conventions and what is metaphor and what are the different uses that we can make of fantasy, right? It can intersect with a lot of sort of sci-fi and fantasy discussions that we might have.
And as the metaphor is applied newly, it's inevitably also going to be an historical overview of the United States. So like, they're introduced right after the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think Magneto is actually causing a missile crisis in the very first issue. So you take that context, it's very much about sort of the hot moment of the Cold War, and it's interesting because Lee's take on superheroes is, at least in the very early 60s, is that superheroes are dangerous. They're not like Golden Age superheroes that are perfect and we can just trust them. When he introduced The Thing, when he introduced the Hulk, he was introducing monsters that could go out of control. And what I noticed is that post-Cuban Missile Crisis, that fear of superheroes, fear of nuclear power, that actually declines, and the X-Men is one of the first new group of superheroes that don't have that fear factor, if you will. They're not, the Thing originally was the idea of the Fantastic Four is that the other 3 were going to have to try to control the Thing, and then the Hulk. If you read the original Hulks, those aren't even superhero comics. That's just a straight up monster. But when the X-Men came in, it was a return in some ways to the old school Golden Age superhero, where these are just straight up good people. They'll take care of us. But Magneto was where the complexity comes in because he wasn't Adolf Hitler. He actually, there was a way to read him as having a pro-social mission. It's just that his definition of society was mutant society.
Mhm.
So there's a different kind of complexity that comes up, really beginning with the first round of X-Men comics.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Mhm.
So to transition then into actually going through our list, is that first run one of the things that we recommend for our X-Men class?
Yes, I would teach the first 3 issues.
Oh,
Yeah.
same. Yeah. That was on my list.
There's a lot
First
of great
issue.
stuff in those first issues. Like there's a scene that I just love where they're all like changing out of their street clothes into their costumes. And there's just so many interesting metaphors bound up in it. Like there's such a rhetoric of like shame and teenage angst, and like Angel has to bind his wings under his clothes. And you get a
Yeah.
panel of him like unbinding them and like changing. And like that's really powerful in terms of talking about the mutant metaphor. I would definitely teach those early ones and the first
Well, and
introduction of the
actually-
Sentinels.
And just metaphor of adolescence there.
Yep. Mhm.
Very much. And the Me Too movement lens on that first couple issues is it's disturbing to see Professor X kind of hitting on Jean Grey.
Oh, yeah.
Very much so.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it
He's
was
a
like
jerk, as
that
we
was,
all know.
yeah, we were to understand that was actually the romance there was between the professor and his teenage female student, and that was acceptable. That was
He eventually
heteronormative.
straight up says he loves her. He's like, "Oh, what am I going to do here?" And then that plot line just goes away. There's
Yes, it does.
Thank goodness.
Thank you.
it's never resolved. It's just like, no, we have decided to think better of this.
Luke and Leia never actually kissed either, right? I mean,
Yeah, but yeah, it is definitely, there are certainly implications of it, which I think are, I always like, for anything like this, I always like to go with one of the earliest works, and in this case, the earliest work, just to lay a foundation, to say, where will this go? But I do think that when you're laying that foundation, you can say, for instance, okay, how do we read these 3 issues in the context of it being 2020? And oh my God, is he really flirting with this 15-year-old student, this old bald man? And that's certainly one thing to start with. But also, like you said, there's the we've been talking about the metaphor for things like race and like the other communities. But at their essence, the X-Men are a bunch of people who just develop powers at adolescence, because your body's going through changes, and you might notice that you grow hair and
You
wings
might
in
notice
odd
that you have to
places.
strap down your wings to.
Yeah.
Right. So the trauma of adolescence is definitely something that I think probably not the kind of othering that your college junior is going to immediately think of when they think of a othered community, is just youth in general, particularly in 1963, in the wake of, comics are still suffering from the CCA, which we've talked about on many shows, and, the wake of the Senate subcommittee hearings on juvenile delinquency, which had been less than 10 years. But also you have a massively burgeoning youth culture across America at this time, with the advent of just, everything from rock and roll still growing to moving toward worrying about Vietnam and things like that. We're in a very weird youth place in America that is the 60s.
Yeah, and X-Men can for sure be a window on that. I would also say that you have to teach X-Men #1, because if you're going to teach the most popular comic book of all time, like X-Men Volume 2 #1 from 1991, it is a direct redo of the original. So like you kind of need that to understand that comic.
Yeah.
Man. All right. So is that the second thing we want to put on the list of possible? X-Men V2
Well, we want to jump
#1?
all the way in there.
Well, we don't have to go in order, but I'm just gonna I'm gonna put it tentatively on the list for now, because what we'll do is we'll go through and make a big list, and then we'll cross things off later.
It's not a comic book that I enjoy, but the fact that it is technically the best-selling comic book of all time means you better talk about it in an X-Men course.
Yeah.
And like I say,
It's not a hard read.
As a mirror of that first issue, it makes sense to talk about it. But I would save that for later in the course.
Mm-hmm.
From that original run, and I don't think we should necessarily spend a lot of time with that original run, but I think that the later Neil Adams Sentinel story of Master.
I was going to say,
I think that would be the next essential piece of that original run.
You know,
Off the top of my head, I don't know.
Okay. So Neil Adams starts drawing X-Men with issue number 56. I think that was in late 1968. And I think he only did about 10 issues. But I agree that Neil Adams, I would say that his artwork became the house style of both Marvel and DC through the 70s.
Yeah.
If there's one artist who defined the next decade, the Bronze Age, if you like that kind of terminology, I think it's Neil Adams. And so, but then this is an important question. If as far as the history of superhero comics, it would be very important to have some Neil Adams in there. However, is that essential to this course that we're imagining?
I think it's essential to understand sort of the complex publishing history of X-Men, though, as well.
Yeah.
And, that they were able to do some experimental things on that Neil Adams run, and part of how he was able to grow and become this influential artist because no one was reading that title. So
I think Neil Adams would certainly tell you that he was the most influential artist himself.
It's nice.
Well, I don't know. Wouldn't some stiff competition from Steranko, maybe?
Well, that's interesting. Adams and Steranko, more or less at the same moment, they're the ones who redefined layout art in the late 60s. And I'd say Steranko was a little more extreme, but he also, the number of works he did is actually surprisingly few.
It's like 30.
Yeah, I know. So he just he burnt out as far as I can tell, whereas Adams had a much longer career.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because the Jack Kirby layouts, certainly with the first issue of X-Men, very rectangular, very row-based, very straightforward. Unlike the stuff he did during the Golden Age, which was, as far as layouts, wildly experimental. So it would be also fun to see Neil Adams working against the house model that Kirby had identified. So it really is a moment of visual revolution to go from Kirby to Adams.
And I think that's an important point. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the kind of character work and emotionalism that Neil Adams really brings out too is maybe important for like the later direction of X-Men. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah.
I also want to point out that the real benefit of this to me is that collection, which is, for the record, it's 56 through 63, and then also issue 65. That collection is in a convenient book that you can buy that's in print. So, which is one of the hard things about teaching a comics course is always how do we get this material?
Exactly.
That one is a bound collection that you can just purchase. So that is a selling point for it.
This course is going to be expensive.
Yeah.
This course is going to be potentially expensive. On the other hand, you could also, one thing that one could do, and if you're following along and you want to read some of the stuff that we're mentioning, since this is all with one publisher for the most part, most of the things that we're going to be talking about are on the Marvel Universe app that you can subscribe to. So,
which, yes, if you're a student, a 3-month subscription would be worth it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's gotten a lot better. I was surprised when I resubscribed like a couple years ago, and it was like a lot better than the last time.
It has been an invaluable dissertation resource for me. I would not be able to finish my work if I didn't have it. And the DC one as well. So
the DC one you can't get in Canada. It's bullshit.
What?
It's also missing. It's also missing a lot of stuff. The DC one's not as good as the Marvel one, but it does have the Harley Quinn TV series, which is worth it. But that's a digression. And off air, maybe Anna will move into my house so that she can have a U.S. address to subscribe.
I could get a VPN or something if I was that committed.
Yeah, that's what I was getting at. Anyway, all right, so I've written those down. What's the next thing somebody would suggest?
Giant size number 1.
We're going roughly chronological.
I was going to say, giant size number 1, although I think there should be a footnote in there explaining how this was not published for a number of years.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we definitely. Yeah.
And the characters would pop up here and there. The physical change of the Beast and Amazing Adventures, just as footnotes that these things happen.
Oh, yeah, I would add that. I'm voting for the physical change of the Beast issue. I would add that.
Yeah, because I think that's important for the whole body morph issues and yeah.
It also reveals something.
You're a teen. You grow blue fur in weird places.
It also shows the Beast transformed in the early 70s. That was related to the fact that the publishing industry was the comics industry was taking a pretty bad hit. They were looking for ways to get more interest going. So that's when all of the horror came back into comics. The Comics Code in 1972 was slightly revised to allow in, and so the Beast transformation coincides with the introduction of vampires and werewolves, and so making him look like a monster was an attempt to appeal to that sort of new superhero horror that was around.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that actually did happen in 1972 as well. That's when in his solo adventures, Amazing Adventures number 11, which was actually 1972, is when that happened, right with those CCA changes.
Yeah. So I say I don't think spending a lot of time in the semester on that stuff is important. But I think it's important to at least address it, point it out.
Agreed. Because I was trying to decide whether I was going to recommend like Ann Nocenti's Beauty and the Beast mini, and I was like, that would be in direct conversation with that.
Ooh, yeah. Ooh, that is a good book that I have not read in many years.
Yeah, me either.
In my head, it's a good book. I mean, whatever comes up. Yeah, that's not one I reread for this episode. Oh, that's a good book. I'm gonna write it down.
I kind of wish I'd reread it now too. I just sort of forgot about it until you were talking about Beast, and I was like, oh, that would be kind of a good deep cut one.
Well, so I'm gonna write that down. So now I'm going to write down the giant size number 1, but here's where I have something that it's one of the things that on my list, I had a proposal that I think is interesting. Rather than teaching giant size number 1 or anything that came after, anything that came immediately after that, because I'm certain that sooner or later we're going to start talking about the Dark Phoenix saga. Like we're going to have to, right?
Yeah.
I oddly enough would recommend the run of X-Men Classics or Classic X-Men, depending on how they felt like printing the logo that week. But X-Men Classic, which was a 1986. Okay. Thank you.
I had one on my list.
Okay. The first 2 volumes are collected, which covers like X-Men Classics 1 through 44, which is basically giant size X-Men number 1 through the end of the Dark Phoenix saga. It is in 2 trade paperbacks. And
that's pretty good.
And now it's odd in that the way X-Men Classics worked was, eventually it became just reprints after like issue 44.
Yeah.
After issue 44. But for issues 1 through 44, it was a reprint of the issue with some inserted pages in order to sort of connect it to changes in continuity that would happen later, which was always odd because it wasn't necessarily the same artist. They didn't necessarily get, which a lot of those early issues, for instance, were burned and they didn't get burned back. So, or they got it back sometimes, but not always. So you just have like random art by whoever the house artist was that Claremont was able to snag to draw 3 pages of X-Men that were inserted magically into issue 98 for no apparent reason. But there is an apparent reason. It sort of connects it to, it sort of tries to make the narrative more cohesive with stuff that would have happened later. And also each of those first 44 issues, or at least most of them, have a backup story that sort of expands upon something that was missing. The very first one, for instance, which I really enjoy, has a story after the Giant Size X-Men covers a rescue mission to Krakoa, which is a mutant island where the original team is dying, and so they've brought in a new team of X-Men. That's where Storm is first introduced, and Banshee, Starfire, Thunderbird.
Not Starfire.
Well, Starfire had been introduced. He's there. He wasn't. Sunfire. Starfire. Yeah, that's a different team. That's a different team, different universe. Maybe we'll do an X-Men Teen Titans syllabus one day. But anyway, Sunfire. Yeah, all the X-Men characters that were the all new, all different X-Men. They show up. Colossus is there. Nightcrawler. And after that story, the original team quits in the original print. Well, there's a backup story that sort of talks about them sort of deciding to do that. And during that backup story, you have the very first time that, in Classic X-Men, you have chronologically the first time that Wolverine and Jean Grey start flirting with each other, while she's in a relationship with Cyclops. And it really, like Claremont knowing what he was going to do with those characters later now, he really starts setting the seams in this story that he's sort of inserted into it, which I think makes it a more interesting read. So
the first of Claremont's many attempts to redo his own continuity.
Yes. Yeah, well, yes. And the one that I accept as not bad, as opposed to some of his other things, which I've never, have not.
I'm assuming X-Men Forever is not going to be on anyone's list, but I'll just
it is not.
It is not. And I hadn't considered the X-Men Classic stuff. It's been so long since I read that, but I was gonna, point I was gonna make at this point of the syllabus is, I don't know that you can do this class without starting at Giant Size X-Men #1 and going through at least up through the end of Days of Future Past as a whole piece.
Right. Which is oddly enough, Days of Future Past is the next arc after Dark Phoenix.
Yeah.
And it is left out of the classic X-Men run for reasons which I could not figure out when I was doing research the last couple of days.
Yeah, you can pick that up as a separate piece. So
yeah, you can get it.
And I think it's absolutely essential.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually looking at one of the trades of Days of Future Past in preparation for the pod, and it collects a bunch of weird stuff with it, including like the X-Men annual that's like Nightcrawler's Inferno, which is one of the most messed up like things ever, and I really got caught up reading that. It's a whole thing. He like has a birthday party, and a really charming birthday party in which one of his presents from Wolverine is a picture of Wolverine. One of my favorite things ever. But his sorceress foster mom accuses him of murdering her son, and they have to go to hell and figure it out. But it turns out he did kill him, but because he was evil, and then she forgives him, and then Nightcrawler's girlfriend is like, "Oh, I was like actually your sister all along," and he's like into it. It ends with everybody hugging, and it's just like, what the F? And like that has screwed up Nightcrawler's continuity to this day.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm particularly here promoting Nightcrawler as well, so I need to start working in more Nightcrawler content. Not one of his finest moments, though.
So I actually like Amanda Sefton, and the sister thing's weird. Let's not talk about it too much.
I'll just tell you, do not tell Nightcrawler fans that you like Amanda Sefton, because they hate Amanda Sefton.
I know, they're wrong.
There is like a whole subgenre of fan fiction that makes her like evil and like guilty of sexual assault and like all of these things.
Oh, I'm aware.
She's not popular. I'm kind of a defender of hers too, but like I was surprised to encounter that.
Okay, so I definitely concur with Days of Future Past as sort of a connection. And it's sort of weird because we were talking about before the show when I was making my list, and I wonder how many other people had this thing. I was like, well, usually when I do a syllabus, I want to try to be well-rounded, and I want to try to get as many authors in as possible and show diversity. And then I got to this, and I'm like, and that Claremont story, and that Claremont story, and that Claremont story. Oh, he wrote the book for 82 years. Of course it's going to be on him. It's actually like 16, but
Well, to back up a little bit, like the stuff up through, say, from Giant Size up to the end of the Dark Phoenix saga. I mean, so much of the Dark Phoenix saga for me, and I'm speaking as someone that I read that stuff as it came out. I bought Giant Size X-Men #1 off the rack. I had a subscription starting with number 98.
Wow, Grandpa, you're old.
Yeah, I know.
I'm right there with you. There with you.
And there's the Dark Phoenix trade paperback, which starts out essentially in the last third of the Dark Phoenix saga. Right. And without all the buildup, you're missing so much of the emotional resonance, the character building, everything that went to it.
Yeah, she's evil. So what? It's the same. It's the same problem as when we discussed, on previous shows where we talked about the Judas contract, which doesn't work if you just start with the trade paperback starts with the reveal on like page fucking 3, and then no.
So I think if there's any run of X-Men comics that are essential to teach the entire thing in this course, it's Giant Size up through the end of at least the Byrne run. And probably, I say there's the Dark Phoenix saga, which is then finished, followed by Days of Future Past and the 2 Canada issues, which I really like, but I don't know how essential they are. But I think teaching all of that and that's a way of teaching the way comics work, this month-to-month continuity of this builds, there's no beginning, there's no real end, keep introducing subplots, it will go on forever.
So the early Claremont run is what you're saying.
Yeah. But in that run, Claremont also introduces about 98% of what everybody who followed him rehashed for the next 30 years.
Yes.
Can we back up and talk about why Giant Size number 1 is so essential? Like kind of the new standard that it sets for X-Men.
Yeah, and you're right. We should, because we all know this, so we're sort of jumping ahead. Yes, Giant Size X-Men number 1.
Meet the new team.
Yeah.
So X-Men actually, I believe, had been on rerun for 5 years before that happened.
Yeah, they did
issue 64 through 96, 95, something like that.
93.
93. Okay.
Yeah. And then, they were reprinted for what, 30 some issues, however many that adds up to. But then it was actually out of publication for 3 or 4 years. There was no X-Men for a period of time. And those characters were guest starring in other books. Marvel team up with Iceman, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Iceman and Angel were in the Champions for a brief period of time.
Later, yeah.
Beast became a Defender later, but he's got a solo. His turning gray then blue was in Amazing Adventures,
right? Yeah, so
he became an adventure.
A time where they were X-Men were referenced in the Marvel universe, but they didn't have their own title. So Giant Size X-Men number 1 came out as a double-size issue, and at the time it felt really radical. I mean, the Avengers would have team changes or whatnot, but it was always they would bring people in, and they just sort of gradually came in. This is a book like, okay, here are 7 characters that you've never heard of before, and they're going to be the team now.
And specifically in terms of it being, but in terms of it being kind of like a metaphor for multiculturalism as well, it's such an important turning point because they're going and assembling mutants from all around the world, and specifically, in many cases, countries that were at war with the United States in World War II, which is significant in terms of this being a post-war superhero comic that is trying to kind of repair some of those rifts, but also appeal to an international audience as well.
Mm-hmm. Because it was overtly here's a Russian member, here's a Japanese member, here's a
German member,
German member,
African,
here's the African
member, Native American. It's crazy.
This weird Canadian.
Which
exotic Canada.
And
yes, we know Africa is a continent and not a country. I would argue that Len Wein did not know that when he added story. Because that's what they do. They go, we're going to get an Irish guy, we're going to get a Canadian guy, we're going to get a Russian guy, a German guy, and an African woman.
Well, you know what's funny?
A country in Africa.
Wakanda, right?
Yeah.
But, first it's Kenya, and then what's interesting in classic X-Men is she's from Harlem, and then they're like, just kidding, she's from Wakanda. You're like, okay, whatever.
All black people are the same, so we'll just represent all of them in one character, which is which is a problem. But again, we're looking at this in 2020 from 1972 eyes, which is this is more than anybody had done up until that point.
Right.
Yeah. It's also of course, Stan Lee was no longer really in charge of things, but it was the classic Stan Lee move. I mean, you look at his early 60s, particularly in his World War II comics, he loved gathering platoons of, quote unquote, diverse characters. And of course, there's also Star Trek, 1966. Basically, the reboot, or it wasn't a reboot, sorry, the restart up of the X-Men was Captain Kirk's bridge. So really, it was not new. Even then, it was already a bit of a contrived idea. So they were sort of picking up on something that was culturally happening all around them, and just did yet another iteration of it.
Yeah, and I mean, in some of my academic work, I've talked about it in conversation with post-colonialism and multiculturalism, for sure.
And I think part of what happens from publishing is Len Wein wrote the Giant Size X-Men, and then starting in 94, Chris Claremont came on as the regular writer of the book, and he was an unknown at that time. Cockrum had done a number of books at that point, and it started out as a bi-monthly comic coming out every other month, and it kind of slowly built an audience till 2 years later, it was their most popular book.
Wow.
In comics is sort of a meteoric rise from here's a team of completely unknown characters to, they're the best-selling characters in comics. Mm. And some of that I do think is due to the quality of what Claremont was doing at that point. was turning comics into a soap opera. They always had been to some degree, but he was doing it more than others. It felt like that to me reading it at the time anyway.
Speaking of soap operas, the person we don't have here, Andrew DeMond, his Twitter thread today was about Paul Smith's work on X-Men, which follows
Paul Smith's run.
Yeah, which is like in the aftermath of Dark Phoenix Saga and stuff. Because I think there's like a little bit of like I don't know what it is. It's like some sort of backwards continuity nostalgia or something where like Paul Smith has really become, for like a lot of fans, like almost the definitive X-Men artist from that era. I know that he's like got an intense like fan love. And so like I'm sort of like, I definitely prefer him to Byrne. Like that is definitely, if I think about 80s X-Men, I'm like, that's the one.
Let me tell you my Paul Smith anecdote then. I went to a convention conventions, let's see, 82 in Pittsburgh. Paul Smith was one of three guests along with Joe Rubinstein, and I forget who the other one was. Paul had started drawing X-Men. His first issue had not yet hit the racks. The only Paul Smith X-Men work we had seen at that point was he did like one issue of Marvel Fanfare that had them in. So he was essentially a complete unknown. It was his first convention ever. And he and my friend just sort of bonded all weekend. And he had a sketchbook with him wherein I saw his drawing of Storm with a mohawk.
Yes, I was going. That's one thing I wanted to point out about that.
Yeah, which his anecdote is he was just drawing that for fun, and Claremont saw it and went, "Oh, we have to do that."
Mm-hmm. Issue 173, by the way.
Yeah, I saw a drawing he had done of Rogue. She hadn't joined the team yet. As I'm flipping through it, and I saw Rogue in Avengers Annual number 10, where she was first introduced. And I liked the character immediately. And I saw this drawing that he had done of her. And I'm like, oh, Rogue is awesome. She should join the team. And he looked at me and said, you've been looking at Chris's notebooks? So I come in with the Paul Smith love of just having met him really, really, really early in his career on X-Men and seeing that stuff. If
you ever talk to him again or have a relationship with him again, tell him how grateful I am for his treatment of Nightcrawler in particular, in which that was the era that I definitely fell in love with him.
Well, Caitlin pointed out that, one of the problems with / good things with, depending on how you look at it, with Storm are, she's from Harlem or Kenya or Wakanda, or who cares, because, we're just trying to represent everybody black in one character. But one of the things that I liked about that run with Paul Smith is, and I don't know if this is a lecture or if it's reading the issue, because it is just issue 173 where he radically changes the look of Storm. You talked about like the male gaze issue, but he goes from her being this exotic African goddess to to someone who came out of a punk club. It's not just a mohawk. It's the outfit.
I think the Storm costume change is included in like the trade paperback version of the Wolverine solo from 1982.
And I would, to back up, I was actually for the class, I was going to recommend we do the Wolverine miniseries as an adjunct piece to this.
I'd second that one. It would be very teachable. It's a very sort of confined story, and you get the transition of Storm into Punk Storm, which is like, and her romance with Yukio.
Yep.
Is that the Frank Miller?
That's the Frank Miller one.
Mm-hmm.
I think historically it's important. It was the first miniseries Marvel did, so sort of presaging the whole limited story. Here's a beginning, middle, and end in one volume kind of thing. Yep. The trade paperback collection, as you say, collects the essentially the Japan stories from Paul Smith's run, which is a direct follow up to the Wolverine issues. It allows us to do Paul Smith. It also allows us to do the Storm stuff. So I think that trade paperback with all of that stuff in it is an important piece.
And that story gives you subtly, but it's there, an entry point to start talking about very early queer representation in the X-Men comics, because there is you have to look for it, and I can see how people missed it back at the time, but it has been explicitly referenced since then that there is a lesbian relationship between Yukio and Storm that begins during that series.
Mm-hmm. And also, it's when Rogue comes onto the team. I mean, it's not the issue where she joins, but she's there, and I think her as an important character. I remember an interview someplace ages ago, Chris Claremont talking about one of his reasons for creating Rogue as a character is all the strong female characters, and he was actually challenged. They all have these costumes that show a lot of flesh, and Rogue's powers is based on the idea of she can't touch anybody, so she needs to be covered. head to toe. And that was part of his motivation for her power set. So any costume you design for Rogue has to cover her from head to toe and not show flesh. Of course, that's been changed over the years.
Yeah, not always followed through by others.
but that was part of the initial conception of the character.
Mm-hmm. So I think those are worth.
In terms of Storm specifically, do we want to? I know a couple of us were maybe going to vote for, like, as a standalone issue, Uncanny X-Men number 186, Life, Death, a Love Story, but featuring Storm and Forge.
That is the next thing on my list.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
What year are we in now? Is that what year?
X-Men 186 is 1984.
Okay.
Oh, okay, great.
Yeah, so that would have absolutely been on my list. Is Life, Death, a Love Story, and the follow-up Life, Death 2, which is X-Men number 198. Not in the same collection, but again, if we're looking at, assuming that our students have picked up a Marvel Universe collection app, I don't think that's a problem. 186 especially is not a superhero story. It is a story of Storm and her boyfriend at the time, Forge. At this point in X-Men continuity, Storm has lost her powers. She's lost her mutant abilities, and she is very much questioning, without my mutant identity, am I still who I was? Which I think is an important issue given what we're talking about with representation. As our central theme for this class, what does it mean to be female or black or queer or whatever other that you're going
powerful.
to? Yeah. So she's lost what makes her her, and she retreats to basically her boyfriend's apartment. No other X-Men no other X-Men appear in this story. It's just Forge, who's not yet an X-Man, and Storm. And then they're hanging out there and essentially falling in love. It's a love story. But then the story essentially ends when she finds out that through random comic book chicanery, he's responsible for her having lost her powers. And
it's just such a great story for teaching. Like just so many different levels of representation in X-Men and the interaction with the mutant metaphor. Because it's a story about disability. Forge is a disabled superhero. Yes. He's a Native American superhero.
There's who lost his arm and his leg in one hand in Vietnam. So it's got,
it's got a lot of things to discuss. And I mean, the artwork is just amazing.
And his power is essentially creativity. He can invent things. So not your typical masculine power either. He's a creative.
Not your typical Native American power either. They're usually magical characters, stuff. And he's a technological character.
Yeah.
And in fact, part of his backstory is, and this has been changed since then, but at that point, he comes from a very stereotypical Native American ancestry where his family members wanted him to be kind of a shaman type character. They wanted him to embrace magic, and he is just like, hell with that. Nope, I'm gonna invent stuff, and I'm going to MIT or whatever he did. And that's kind of his character. It is an entire story about what is identity, and I think I think it's short enough that I think that if you're going to teach it, you teach Life, Death 2 as well, which I don't like as much, but I think is sort of, I wonder if for other people, maybe they'll like it better, because outside of the context of knowing who these characters are and having grown up with them as I was doing at that time, Life, Death 2 is Storm. After this, just sort of leaves and goes to Africa to rediscover herself. And again, it's her going on basically a voyage of self-discovery, which I think is a good coda to the story. But I think Life, Death stands alone. Life, Death 2 does not.
Yeah.
It needs the earlier story in order to work.
I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll say in particular, the scene from Life, Death, where they're swimming in the pool, and it's like a romantic scene and a sexual scene, but then also just so many layers of power get discussed. Like, Storm considers herself depowered because she's lost her mutant power, but then she realizes that Forge doesn't have his leg, and that affects his ability to swim. So you get all of these intersections about what power means, like over the course of their negotiating whether they're going to have a relationship. It's a great issue.
It's also visually a particularly good moment, if I'm recalling correctly, because she's in the pool and then she's climbing out of the pool and she sees his leg just lying there. So it's really a pretty brilliant move. So we don't see him take the leg off, and she doesn't either.
You see him put it on. You see him climb out. He has to crawl out of the pool. Right. It's a very vulnerable picture for a superhero story where he crawls because he can't walk. So he crawls over to put his leg back on, which is just brilliant,
But I think, vulnerability is like the thing that makes both issues really beautiful, because in 182, Mav, like you were starting to point out, like there is this reclamation of Storm finding that strength. And I think that speaks, if we're thinking about representation, especially of Black women, I think that's something very powerful. Like this woman in this moment is like realizing that she does have this inner strength and like ultimately saves herself.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
So, I think vulnerability and strength are like, if we're thinking about like the narrative arc of all of X-Men, it's really beautifully reflected in these two issues.
Mm-hmm.
And, even the duality of that title, that it's life, death, a love story, and like it ends with Storm like unequivocally rejecting Forge.
Yeah. So I think we're at the point in the continuity, just historically speaking, now we need to address the franchising of X-Men. This is the point where New Mutants comes in and X Factor comes in, etc.
Yep.
All the series.
I would love to talk about New Mutants. That's actually the top of my list.
Yeah.
Figured somebody would.
We were talking about, the importance of Neil Adams. Bill Sienkiewicz is,
absolutely.
It's just, that's interesting because he started out as a Neil Adams imitator, like when he was doing the Midnight series, but it was starting with issue 18 of New Mutants, and his run goes to 31. Yeah. With Demon Bear, 1984, 1985. That to me is one of the most important runs of the 80s, and that's even against other canonical things. Sienkiewicz what he did was no one had seen anything like this in mainstream comics before. It was just extraordinary, and the character. Demon Bear, it was interesting because Demon Bear was introduced by an earlier artist. I think it was, I scribbled his name, Bob McLeod, and he just looks like a dorky bear,
not a scary bear.
No, not scary at all, almost like comically not scary. And then Sienkiewicz took over, and it just was like, oh my God, what the hell is going on? And I was actually reading comics then, and I saw the transition. When the Demon Bear issue came out, it was like, the cover alone was, what the hell is going on? It was interesting because this is also the moment where painted covers was the new thing in around 1983. There was a defense, but usually it was only the cover art. But then you open up New Mutants and you see this style that just had never happened before. It didn't last. I thought like that would be the a turning point in the history of superhero comics, but really, Sienkiewicz and a couple others were, mavericks, if you will. And then it really kind of just returns to the standard style. And then, of course, the 90s happen, and you just have to close your eyes for a decade.
Well, I think I agree. I think teaching that Sienkiewicz run is really important. Would we include the first New Mutants, quote unquote, trade paperback, the Marvel trade paper, whatever they were being called at the time? That introduced the characters.
I wouldn't include that. I would teach Demon Bear and the Slumber Party issue that directly follows it.
Okay. Well,
so you go 18 through what? 18 through 22 is what you would say, Anna?
Yeah.
Because my jump would be from. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm wondering if we need the other one just to introduce the characters. So
I
don't know.
Just jump in.
Because it really does. Formulaically, the early New Mutant stuff is, like here, I can do it as I would teach it in the class. Okay, remember when we read X-Men #1 and we saw like how the class was introduced of Cyclops? Okay, so Professor X just does it again with new kids. Okay, moving on. Now we're at 18.
Here's a question. The Paul Smith issues that are included in the Wolverine miniseries, do they include them coming back from space? Because we see the New Mutants there. That might be in that collection. I don't remember.
Think it is, but I don't have it in front of me right now. I'm not in my office due to pandemic reasons. So
for listeners, we just lost Caitlin. She had to leave as we record, so you won't hear her voice for the rest of the episode. But what I was going to say is, I would move from I would move from the Demon Bear sort of saga. I would move into Asgardian Wars. There's a trade paperback of it. The drawback here is probably after Demon Bear, one of the most well-known New Unit stories, I'd argue, is the Shadow King saga, which I'd be skipping in order to get to the Asgardian Wars, which is sort of the kids recovering from the Shadow King saga. And I don't know, like, I don't know that Shadow King, it's a story that I like, but I don't know that from an academic teaching perspective, it offers anything that isn't offered by Demon Bear and better.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I held away from it.
I get, I'm going to say at this point, and this just reflects where I was as a reader at the time. This is the point where my interest in the entire franchise starts going downhill.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how much essential there is from this point on. There are things.
Yeah, I've got a few. I mean, we're going to be spottier for me too. But
we haven't even gotten to my beloved Excalibur yet, guys. Come on.
We're gonna move. Yeah, we're gonna move for me too.
And that's it. In the franchising stuff. I mean, we've talked about New Mutants. Which other ones are kind of worth looking at? So,
I mean, I considered repping Alpha Flight as a Canadian. I don't know that I would argue that it's essential necessarily. I mean, I might teach the North Star Comes Out issue, not because it's good, but because it's historical and relevant. So I might put that on there. I should look at what issue that actually is.
Asgardian Wars, but I don't necessarily think Asgardian Wars is amazing. I like Art Adams' artwork because I think that he is the best of what the image artist later tried to replicate, which becomes the X-Men style for quite some time. But I like that story because it shows the younger kids in recovery mode, in a way that, that frankly the Slumber Party issue does too. But there's a lot of talk of trauma, problematic issues of, in order to be powerful, you've got to be hot. but it's also very much a rediscovering yourself issue, which is, frankly replicating a lot of what we've talked about in Life Death as well. So.
Yeah, Asgardian Wars is a good one though too for having those kind of conversations about power and stuff. We actually did it on a 3-panel contrast not too long ago in conversation with House of X, Powers of X. So we clearly thought it was worth talking about.
And my next one after that, actually it should have been prior, but I did them out of order because I was sort of trying to get away from X-Men. I actually had the Magic series, which is a 4-issue limited series, that introduces, as a primary character, it introduces Illyana Rasputin, my favorite X-Men. My answer to Nightcrawler for Anna is Illyana, and it is how she comes to power. For listeners, she is a 5-year-old girl who falls into a magic portal where she grows up and doesn't come back till she's like 16. And
the magic portal is hell.
So she grows up in hell, fighting for her life and taking over. That is the story of Magic. She is Colossus's little sister, and if the New Mutants movie ever comes out, she will be in that.
Oh, it has a release date.
She's Andrew's favorite too.
Yeah, she's right up there on my list as well.
It's had many release dates.
Yeah,
fair.
So that was in my list. But again, I mean, so many of mine are, let's look at how one member of the team looks when they are ostracized from the rest of the team. Because what I find fascinating about Storm during the Life Death run and about Magic for her entire time is the X-Men is by definition a group of outcasts. They are others. They are, whatever metaphor. And then here's the one person, if all the outcasts are banding together in order to have like a sense of community, what do I do when I don't even fit in with the fucking outcasts?
And you can tie that back to the Paul Smith Japan issues because Rogue comes in and there's marvelous panel of her by herself. Just as a theme, I think that's important.
Yeah, I'd be good with doing the Magic series. I think it's sort of one of those ones, just depending on your own interest, you could add it to the course or not. But yeah, that's would be a very teachable one, I think.
Anybody else got anything from this sort of time period?
1988. This is one of my all-time favorite comics. Not even just within superhero comics, and it's odd, but Havoc and Wolverine Meltdown.
I have that.
It is.
I have a trade of
It's
that.
actually, I mean, the writing is fine, but the artwork is revolutionary, even more than Sienkiewicz, because there are two artists. You've got John Muth and you've got Kent Williams. They both had worked at Epic, at Marvel before this. What's fascinating is that there's a variety, there's so many ways for artists to work together, but of course the standard conveyor belt system is scripter hands penciler, the script penciler sketches it all out. It goes to the inker, it goes to the colorist, it goes to the letterer. What Muth and Williams did is Muth drew Havoc and Williams drew Wolverine, and even when they were on the same page, there would be two very distinct styles, and they weren't working with pencils and inks. Muth works primarily in watercolors, and Williams works primarily in oil paint. And so it's fascinating to see their distinct styles interacting on the page. It was looking at this comic that made me. One of the books that I'm working on right now is trying to harmonize comics theory right now. And one of the terms I've been using is an image narrator as unique from a text narrator. And what this miniseries does is reveal that there's really two image narrators, and one is the imagery connected to one character, so it's filtered or focalized through Havoc. The other is filtered through Wolverine. And it explains so much about the reality of a comic rather than seeing a drawn image as like I'm looking through a window into another world and this is what that world looks like. It's much more about a filtered, I'm seeing this world through someone's mind, and this is how that mind is, in this case, literally drawing it. So seeing these two artists work back and forth, sometimes one would do an entire page because Havoc would be over here doing something, and Wolverine would have a separate adventure. But when they're merged, to see these two styles interacting on the same page, I really actually can't think of another comic that does this.
Not as drastically. I can think of lots of comics where they've been drawn by multiple people, but
comics,
or mini hands, but
right.
But not as drastically and as clear of a storyline. You know what? Oh, actually, you know where I can think of it happening? Underground comics, specifically Dirty Laundry comics by Crumb and Kaminsky. Certainly not mainstream, but they did mini comics which they wrote together, and he always drew himself and she always drew herself.
Nice.
And then eventually their child, when old enough, Sophie would also draw herself into the comic as well.
That's
so it is extremely disjointed, and obviously given, if you're familiar with Crumb and Kaminsky's work, they are crazy people whom I love. I mean, that's not an insult.
With radically different styles.
Yes. And but it is that's the only thing I can think of where it is used as an element.
Yeah. That's excellent. No, I'm gonna have to look that up. That's perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that Havoc Wolverine series is wild. I picked it up at a used bookstore like a couple years ago, and I was just like, well, this is weird. And
I haven't read that in so long.
Yeah, I don't think I've read it.
The story is fine. It's very post-Chernobyl, right? So very, very 1980s.
Mm-hmm.
But
well, we haven't talked much about it, but that is the Atomic World is very much a theme, especially the earlier X-Men stuff. It sort of was almost dying out of X-Men comics by the time Meltdown came out. But that was they were children of the atom was what Stan called them back in the day.
Right.
Are any of us interested in repping Dazzler, the graphic novel, as a historical document?
Wow.
I don't know if I can make anybody read it.
There's so many Dazzler fans out there. I don't want to let them down.
There was a movie treatment.
I will say that the first issue of the Dazzler series is historically significant in that it's the first direct sales only title from Marvel.
Oh wow!
So he gets mentioned in my class.
Yeah.
Can you teach it?
I don't know whether teaching like Dazzler the graphic novel is very effective, like in terms of teaching what's most interesting about it, which is that it was supposed to be this transmedia thing that never happened.
It was a transmedia thing that had one piece of media and therefore was not very trans. It was they had a whole thing. There was like going to be an album. There was going to be a concert tour and a movie.
Oh, wow.
And then it was just a comic.
Yeah.
Because everybody else is like
that no one read.
Yeah. And everybody else was, I mean, it's a thing. It's interesting. And
I will mention that, I mean, Dazzler becomes like a real focal point for a lot of queer fans in her 80s series in particular. So, I mean, in that sense, it's like worth mentioning. I mean, I might excerpt a couple of issues from it to talk about.
More so than the graphic novel. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. I think it's worth, I think it's, I don't know what to pick though. I think that those are so hard to teach. Like you sort of have to
the issue where I'd have to look up what issue it is, but like the one where she goes to basically the lesbian bar and fights the Racine Ramjets has a lot of gender stuff going on, and it has a Sienkiewicz cover, which is fabulous.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned it sort of eventually transitions into Beauty and the Beast, which Dazzler is the beauty of Beauty and the Beast.
Mm-hmm. And oddly enough, the Beast is
the Beast.
Yes,
and they have a. I haven't read it. I haven't read it in decades. But what I remember is a very beautiful love story that was basically never mentioned again by any other writer. But it was a thing.
That would be my thing of like, if you're going to teach magic, I might do Beauty and the Beast on my course.
I could totally buy that. I mean, the thing with the syllabus is like, we would all do this class very different or slightly differently. I don't know if we do it very differently, but
we're in a lot of agreement here with the basic stuff. Yeah.
Is this the point where I get to make my pitch for Excalibur? Like, are we there? Because we made it to 1988, which is the launch of Excalibur.
All right.
Yeah. This is the franchising of the different stuff, because there's not much in X Factor that I would want to talk about.
You'll see where I put X Factor on my list, because there's almost nothing in X Factor I want to talk. Go ahead, Excalibur.
Excalibur. Yeah.
Okay, so if I was going to choose Alpha Flight or Excalibur, I would go Excalibur. They like kind of allow you to talk about some similar things in terms of like franchising and stuff. So the basis of Excalibur is that it becomes this UK-based superhero team founded by Kitty Pryde and Nightcrawler after they get gravely injured in a fight with the Marauders and find themselves at Moira McTaggart's Research Institute in Scotland and end up meeting up with Captain Britain and Megan and a resurrected Rachel Grey and forming Excalibur. So the one I would specifically rec would be the mini that started it, Excalibur, The Sword is Drawn from 1988 by Chris Claremont and Alan Davis. I think it's the most teachable. I would say that Excalibur is like a uniquely unteachable text because it's all over the place. And I like
one of my favorite books, but let's go on
it's a classic
cross multiversal journey that starts in British and Marvel UK comics that literally none of our readers have access to or could have possibly read at that point. It was crazy.
I want to pay Alan Davis too to go back and redraw, like, because there's a huge part of the Cross Time Caper, which is like one of the definitive Excalibur arcs that like just has a bunch of different artists. And if Alan Davis had been drawing the whole thing, I would teach that, but he doesn't, so I wouldn't.
A bunch of different artists, and without mentioning names, some of them are not good.
Some of them are not good. Excalibur is really like a Claremont Davis like vision, and anybody else doing it is just like not kind of the same. Anyway, so Sword is Drawn. There's a number of things that you could use it to talk about. It's a female dominated team, which I think is really great. You get 3 distinct female characters. You get kind of the Rachel Grey character, who's kind of quite aggressive and ultra powerful, but also like uniquely marked by trauma. She's from the Days of Future Past world. You get Kitty Pryde as like the teen genius who's like really coming into her own kind of during this era. You get Megan, who's like a very different type of character. On the one hand, she's kind of like a traditional feminine femme type character, and yet she's rendered somewhat monstrous by her powers as well. We're introduced to her in The Sword is Drawn, where she's like morphed into a dolphin person swimming in the sea. And like, there's so much going on. And I mean, if you're a Nightcrawler fan, it's the definitive Nightcrawler series. It's like kind of the zaniness of Excalibur, the way it's kind of like this action comedy wacky thing extends pretty directly kind of from the characterization of Nightcrawler. And I always think about the Uncanny 204, like the Whatever Happened to Nightcrawler story, where he has the zany adventure in like Murder World, Arcade's Murder World, and like saves a princess and stuff, which was totally out of step with like the more serious tone of X-Men at the time. That's like almost a trial run for Excalibur.
What Excalibur got massively right with Nightcrawler was that he, I shouldn't say every, most other writers sort of there are two paths you take with Nightcrawler. Either he is the ridiculous comedy character or he is the uber religious stick in the mud character. And he's not. He's both of those things. He walks that line perfectly. He is a religious guy. He is a deeply religious Catholic who also is just kind of the kooky class clown. And also tortured by his monstrous appearance. Like he's got a lot going on, and people tend to just take one route because like trying to write him in all three directions is hard.
I mean, the religious aspects of the character too are like relatively recent. That's like something that's really emphasized with the character. I mean, it's not present in Excalibur, like basically ever.
And it's a piece of his character I've had a tough time really buying into.
I mean, his creator, Dave Cockrum, was violently against that as a block point for
him. There's the scene, once again, was this Paul Smith's run or Cockrum right before when they're with the Brood? And there's a great one-page scene of him and Wolverine talking about religion.
It's from the Paul Smith era,
Yeah, and that one page is kind of brilliant, and I'm fine with that. But then later he's a priest, and like, no.
Yeah, it's too much. It's going too much in the other direction. Like he is supposed to be a real person. Like he having a guy who was ostracized from society and therefore took refuge in the church because no one was looking at him. I'm cool with that.
Yeah.
I get that. But like they just took it too far. And I think Excalibur doesn't do that. Excalibur puts him in a place where he can be amongst his people and comfortable.
And it's a really like in terms of, I mean, again, this would be something that's impossible to teach really, but it's like really like the character development for him in particular in that series. Like he does a lot of kind of reflecting on his original place within the X-Men and, I was just their fun loving mascot and like they didn't take me seriously. But then he has this really wonderful character progression of becoming a leader. And one of the great things about it too is that he's very like diminished in terms of his power throughout the series. So both he and Kitty Pryde start the series with their superpowers basically all out of whack. Like Nightcrawler can barely teleport anymore, and he doesn't really get his teleportation power back until like 50 issues in. And then Alan Davis comes back as both the writer and the artist for it, and for about 14 issues, Nightcrawler has a broken leg, so he doesn't even have his physicality. And yet that's like some of his best character growth. That's like really when he grows into a leader, because if he is going to be just this sort of fun-loving joke character, his physicality is a big part of that. But having to make it more about sort of his interiority and his character and like taking away his physicality to do that is like, that's my kind of Excalibur spiel in terms of if you are a fan of Nightcrawler at all, it's an essential series.
And it's fun.
So fun.
When Rogue became the leader of the X-Men, she also did that when she lost her powers. It's interesting that you've got these.
And Storm did too.
And Storm did too.
Yeah, that's what I thought I said.
Yeah.
That's interesting. What question about Nightcrawler? Because I forget at what point, and I think it was retconned, and that's why it's hard to track. I think it was one of those retconned pages into those reprints of Classic. But Nightcrawler used to have a holograph disguiser. And at some point, and this was retconned in, I think it was a conversation with Wolverine, he decides he no longer wants to hide his appearance, which of course is a critical detail for his character. I assume that happened before the Excalibur run, is that correct?
I'm not sure whether that would have. I mean, he has the image inducer before that, and doesn't use it throughout Excalibur. But the classic X-Men story you're talking about is The Big Dare, and I'm not sure what year that is from. I would have to look it up.
But he does. He certainly. I believe there are issues of Excalibur where I've got this thing, but he very rarely uses it by the time he's leading Excalibur, and especially in Cross Time Caper, most of that is so much out in the multiverse where there are all kinds of aliens far weirder looking than him running around. So
and he gets to go to a whole world full of blue people, and then later in X-Men: The End, marries one of them randomly. That's a deep Nightcrawler cut for you.
I like it.
Well, so I'm not a huge X Factor fan.
I'm not either.
there's a lot of me wanting to like. There's a lot of stuff that happens in X Factor that I want to like. My favorite stuff in X Factor are the moments that follow Richter and Rusty and Skids, and Artie and Leech, who are the least important characters and eventually get spun out of the book. But since we're talking about the franchising series, and since it just sort of almost perfectly leads into Anna's pick right there of Excalibur, and in fact was the storyline that caused it, I actually put on the trade paperback for the Mutant Massacre. Okay. And that was because of where I was going with like sort of all this othering and all of these ostracized people. The Mutant Massacre is a genocide that happens in the Morlock tunnels. The Morlocks are the mutants who aren't even acceptable enough to live at the X-Men school, so they live in tunnels. And then one day, a group of bad guys is hired to go in and exterminate them all. And they just do a genocide in the tunnels. And so the X-Men and X-Factor, which is another team, and the New Mutants all sort of... and Thor and Daredevil for some reason, all go down there. And Power Pack. I think for one issue, Power Pack, because they're in the tunnels under New York City. So there's a genocide. So a bunch of heroes go down and try to save people, and they fail. They largely fail, and just the mutant population of the tunnels is just decimated for these 4 months. And during that time period, Kitty and Kurt are brutally hurt, and that's why they end up having to go off and form Excalibur, because they're recuperating on Mur Island. But
I'll say one other thing that one of the things that, I mean, in terms of Excalibur as kind of a genre mixing book, and in terms of it sort of extending from the things that I like about Nightcrawler, the fact that it's like a team founded in trauma but responds to that trauma with joy.
Yeah, agreed. Mm-hmm. I don't love the story Mutant Massacre. I just feel like it was a important changing point.
In there's where I started losing track of all the crossovers.
So many teams. So many crossovers. Because the next year after that, they do Fall of the Mutants, and the year after that, they do Inferno. And it's just like, and Fall of the Mutants is only a crossover because they all say Fall of the Mutants on it. Like the teams never even see each other. It's very, right. This is the beginning of event driven writing in Marvel, and it just becomes tiring. But I feel like at least Mutant Massacre has something to say. Inferno has something to say as well, but it's not very good. Fall of the Mutants has something to say in the New Mutants issues, which we were talking about Sienkiewicz before, but this is the Brett Blevins era, which is somebody I actually also like. He had a very different. He was very distinctive looking from what a lot of the other comics were at his time.
What was the name of the artist?
Brett Blevins.
Yeah, that's a run I didn't read much of.
Yeah, well, it's where what's interesting about the Fallen Mutants story is it's where New Mutants, which was always the kids' book of the X-Men series, they were largely protected. They go on a mission, and Doug Cypher, their least powerful member, gets killed. because there are a bunch of kids going on a superhero mission by themselves when they were told not to, and one of them dies because of it, and it changes the direction of the book for quite some time after that. So it's interesting, but not. I don't know that it's teachable.
Yeah.
Well, if you want to get genocide in there, because clearly, sorry, we skipped over, and I was surprised. God Loves, Man Kills, 1982.
Oh my god, yeah.
You're right.
Because that's in my graphic novel section, which is the next thing. But yeah, graphic novel is another. It's the only graphic novel I have. After that, I have movie, I have two, sort of. God Loves, Man Kills, which is
absolutely.
I did reread it for this pod, and it had been a while, and it is kind of indisputably a very teachable X-Men text. It is sort of like all the X-Men stuff is in one book, and you can kind of just teach it from there.
Mm-hmm. And it's wonderfully dated. I mean, cringingly dated, which is useful, actually. I mean, like the use of the N-word. It's startling to see that, in 1982. Mm-hmm. I don't know. It's an interesting book. It's a shame that Neil Adams didn't draw it. He originally was the artist, and then the Brent Anderson artwork though is still quite good. But it was interesting that actually would have been a Neil Adams graphic novel.
Yeah, that would have been interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'll note too that I think the first page of it is a black child getting shot as well, graphically on panel.
It is the time when Marvel in 1982 said, yes, everything that we're doing with the X-Men is a metaphor. We want you to know that we are doing civil rights. We are socially aware. We are letting you know this. We, Marvel Comics, writers of the X-Men. And that's it. And it's like, and then he's like, and the bad guy is a Bible thumping preacher who's like, yeah, religion says that mutants are bad. And they're like, but that's just like race. And it's like, no, it's not. It's different because I'm saying so right now. And they're like, no, it's not. And that's the story of God Loves Man Kills.
I mean, I'll say like that story is good for talking about the problematics of like mutant representation in a character like Nightcrawler too, who comes to stand for kind of every prejudice, which is like ridiculous and problematic because it flattens everything out because he just includes every like othered group, which is like nonsense because we're starting off with like a black child getting shot and then like Nightcrawler becomes like this emblem and I'm like, it's not great. It's not great. It's kind of like that problem of how like the mutant metaphor almost like includes too many people and then you have some of those intersectional discussions getting lost. But I mean, that's a text where you can teach that concept, I think.
So God Loves Man Kills for intersectionality. That's my last comic. Everything else that I have is, the only other one I have that I was going to save for the end is Hoxpox, but I don't know even how much.
And we've talked for 2 hours and we're up to 1980.
So everything else I have is, I mean, I had just Old Man Logan, but more Logan the movie because I think it's a better representation than Old Man Logan is, which is Old Man Logan's great if you're a comics fan, but like too much to teach. So I had that, and I had the X-Men animated series, season 1 and season 3, which do the Dark Phoenix saga and Days of Future Past. So
and completely skipping, all the early 90s and. Yes.
Please skip the 90s. Yes.
Yeah. Should we do a follow-up episode? Is this a 2-semester course?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's weird because I think that stuff's important, but I think it's a deviation from like if you're going to go into stuff like when we talked about X-Men #1, which is very much a recreation and sort of a retelling of what's in the first one. In the first, I mean, X-Men #1, new X-Men #1 by Jim Lee and Chris Claremont very much is readdressing what happened in that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby book. But I mean, even down to the cover is very much a recreation of it.
I just watched. There was a Claremont documentary I just watched on Amazon Prime, and they do kind of talk about how. The new young creators coming in the early 90s and the Image guys, what became known as the Image guys, they grew up with this stuff and they kind of wanted to do their take on it. Claremont was so wanting to move forward, and I do believe a little burnout at that point in his career.
It's been 16 years.
The new guys came in and just wanted to reset everything. So like all the character development he had done with Magneto over the years, nope, he's a bad guy again. Look, missiles, Asteroid M. And it was in many ways the X-Men #1 from the early 90s, the best-selling one, was a reset of everything Claremont had done. And I think that has continued for a long time since then as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in terms of like stuff from the 90s, that's post-90s stuff, would we include anything of Deadpool on this course?
The first movie. The first movie, because I think anything else in the comics, I know people love Deadpool. I don't, but it's not even about whether I love him or not. It's about, I think that Deadpool is its own course that requires such an understanding in the Marvel Universe in order to really enjoy, or you're just enjoying him shooting stuff and acting weird, or you're deconstructing on a level that is not really about the X-Men. It's about deconstructing Marvel Comics. I think that the first movie is watchable in a vacuum, and that's it.
Yeah, well, and that's it. I mean, at this point, do we rule out New Mutants, X-Force, all the things that happened in the 90s? Do we stop the course at the end of the Claremont run?
I feel awful about doing that because that is like stopping us like at a point where like the X universe still isn't that diverse and stuff. I mean, we're not including things like their first gay wedding. Like we're not including things like the further diversifications of the universe in the 21st century. I mean, I think we'd have to think, and it might have to be another pod. Like if you were going to do a 21st century X-Men course, what would you choose?
Well, and maybe that's it. Maybe it just goes through, maybe that's it. Maybe there is a definitive break that is, the X-Men through, through the Image years. And then there's a course that starts, and I know it's not Image Comics because they all left. But we have no better. The X-Men through that era, which is the very end of the Claremont run. And probably a year after that, because he wasn't writing all that stuff. Like I think that the stuff that Louise Simonson's doing in New Mutants is great. So I think there's that era, But what it becomes is very much something different, which becomes it becomes a book about the franchise and about the teams and their interaction and their different beliefs rather than how individuals live within this other community.
I agree, but there's been a lot of good kind of 21st century minis that you could do. Like you could do like Jamie Madrick's Multiple Man, like as like a good teachable one and stuff. So like, I mean, it's sort of about picking things that would intersect in interesting ways with that older stuff.
And the reason I skipped it because I said I was done with comics other than the movies. But the very last thing on my list is House of X, and I have Hox Pox, which is for non-comics fans. House of X, Powers of X is a very epic series that was just published last year that tries to reestablish what the X-Men are within the Marvel universe. And is it 12 issues between the two of them, or
between the two?
Okay, 6 issues
and it was collected all as one piece.
Yeah,
so.
6 issues of House of X, 6 issues of Powers of X. It goes back and forth. And my argument would be for this class, I would want to teach House of X. I find Powers of X very interesting. I don't think it fits in with it. I don't think it's necessary, even though it fleshes it out to make it a full story.
I think when you read both of them in the order that they're supposed to be read in, it's all one story. I no longer separate them when you read them all as one piece.
If you're reading it not that way, I think Powers of X is not as interesting if you're not enough of a geek.
I think it's emblematic of the unteachability of 21st century X-Men comics.
Yes.
There you go.
Yeah.
Another way to think about this course, though, Matt, I think you said earlier, there are courses that are focused simply on one author. You named Shakespeare among others.
Yeah.
One of my frustrations sometimes with comics is the fact that we don't organize around authors. We organize around characters or teams or series, which strikes me as obviously it's there are reasons why you want to do that as well, but I don't see courses that are organized around authors. So of course, the fact that Claremont has 16 years plus other works connected, if everything on the syllabus was written by Claremont, obviously there's going to be multiple artists because that would reduce it too much. But if you only allowed Claremont works on the syllabus, that would be focusing on an author instead of simply on who's your favorite character.
Except for if I was going to do that, I wouldn't do. If I would have gone a different direction and picked a bunch of Claremont stuff that wasn't X-Men, and that's
right.
It's so the problem is with for mainstream comics, not for the indie guys and the creator-owned stuff, but for mainstream comics, the problem is since the authors are the characters are owned by the corporations, and so the authors can't. There's no guarantee of stability. Like the reason Andrew is doing the Claremont run is not just because Claremont's good, but because a 16-year run on one book is phenomenal. In any age of that's it. Lee didn't do that. Stan didn't do that, and he was the only writer working for part of that time. And he wasn't there for what's his longest run is like I think 9 years.
Fantastic
Four,
and it's like 9 years. So Claremont almost doubled that. It's a remarkable achievement that I think is hard.
Yeah.
What do we want to end on? Do we want to rep our favorite X-Men movies then? As a capstone?
I want to see, because we've got a bunch of books. I want to just go through them real quick and see what I'm going to put a star next to stuff that I think would be essential. Because I think that the answer for this one, more so than like the other syllabus episodes, is I think we're going to require people taking the class get a subscription to the app. But so I kind of want to go through and say what would be essential reading and what would be something that you say is a recommended possible independent study project. If we have, everybody's got to read these 10 books and then you can read other stuff to do your project on. So X-Men 1 to 3, I think you can just say, because it would take, frankly, it's 60 pages and I think it would take you half an hour to read. Anybody against that one?
Nope.
Good with me.
Yeah. The next thing we talked about was X-Men Volume 2, number 1, which was the Jim Lee thing, which I think if we could separate out, if we did the two different versions of the class, we wouldn't necessarily need it. That could be a spring thing.
Could be. I'd probably include it if I was going to, just because it's the best-selling comic of all time. If you're going to talk about sort of revisions and reboots and it's emblematic of the style of the 90s. Yeah, I would end it. I think that would be
Yeah, maybe that's the last comic.
nice.
Next,
unless you take the advanced course.
Yeah. X-Men by Thomas and X-Men by Thomas and Adams, the Gallery edition is that collects that's the Neil Adams run that collects 56 through 65.
Yeah, I think that's important.
Okay.
I'm there.
Explain the gaps. Not okay. So the next thing that we have is Amazing Adventures number 11, which is the Beast Turns Blue.
I like it, but I don't think you need it.
Yeah,
that's probably someone's
Optional.
individual optional thing.
I think mentioning it in the class, but not requiring it.
Mm-hmm. Beauty and the Beast by Ann Noxeni, which I love, but I don't think I can. I don't think I can force it.
I'd have it on my course, but optional.
Yeah, I think there's going to be some of that where we each customize it. So then we have Giant Size 1, Dark Phoenix, Days of Future. I think that all of that you can just say, like I said, X-Men Classics Volume 1 and 2.
Okay.
And that gives you Giant Size and all those stories. And the thing with a class like X-Men is, unlike some of the other graphic novel courses where we're talking about 200-page books, when we're talking about one book, it's 22 pages. It's not. This is not heavy reading.
Right.
But I would say that also includes, and Days of Future Past. Okay. Wolverine miniseries.
Yeah.
I think so. With those Japan issues after, because of the Storm stuff and the Rogue stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm voting for that too.
Okay, then we have Life, Death 1 and 2.
I would definitely teach it. Some of that might be a bit repetitive of the Wolverine series, but I mean, I don't know. I think it does some different things, and I would vote for it.
Yeah,
I think it fits into that same series because it's very much a self-discovery of Storm section. Okay, so now we're moving away from X-Men. This is where we had New Mutants, and we named 18 to 21. I mean, that's the Demon Bear saga, which I think if you want to teach any New Mutants, I think that's the one. I think you can skip Asgardian Wars, even though I love it.
Non-essential. Sure. Yeah, I think Demon Bear would be better.
And magic is what I teach the week that Anna's teaching Beauty and the Beast. I can't fight
Beauty and the Beast. The Beauty and the Beast trade too. I'm looking at it now. It includes Dazzler graphic novel, so I can do both.
Oh wow! Okay, there you go.
And would I be teaching Meltdown during that same week?
Well, that was the next thing on the list. I think there's a week where it's like where we have professor's favorite, which could be magic, could be magic, could be Beauty and the Beast, could be Meltdown. What would you pick for that week, Wayne?
Magic is on my list. I have to give some more thought because not the Iceman miniseries.
Yeah. And then we have Excalibur, Sword is Drawn. I think so. I think you keep it. Because it depends.
The Alan Davis artwork is great for teaching sort of like visual character work too. So I think there's a lot you can do formally with it.
Yeah.
Well, I would put Mutant Massacre before it because it leads into it. I would put Mutant Massacre particularly because it's if you're gonna do, and here's where we move into the franchise era, and here's where there's the crossover era, and that leads to the Excalibur stuff. So I would do Mutant Massacre because it's where Nightcrawler gets hurt, and then move into Excalibur.
I would argue you don't need to read Mutant Massacre, but I'm okay for including it.
Yeah, I just and then somewhere I think you gotta fit God Loves Man Kills.
Yeah,
I would include it. It's like one of the most teachable X-Men texts. So, and it's teachable not because it's perfect, but because it's problematic in all the emblematic ways that X-Men is problematic.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's actually not bad. We've got
I think for my week, I'm going to do the X-Men Teen Titans crossover just to confuse people.
Oh wow!
Oh, I thought about that. Yeah,
that would be interesting. I actually did think about it. I'm like, what do you learn? But it'd be interesting.
I'd have to give it more thought, but I actually think there's something there.
Just counting, I think this is a 13-week course. I mean, I think that you because then if you end on X-Men V2 number 1, I think you've got a 13-week course that
all right.
is I think you could teach it. I think that it's customizable to, especially with the you have the Professor's Choice week, and then you have so we have 4 sections where we're each doing a different Professor's Choice. And then you have a week where you have a week where students do their own creative projects, and they'll toss in a Dead Man movie or a Logan or something. So I think that there's a
Maybe
class
they could
here.
be maybe they could be specifically required to pick a 21st century series and do a project on that, and that would be a way to incorporate that.
That would be amazing.
Yeah, that's actually good.
Because
Yep.
because one of the things that
And we can certainly offer recommendations with that.
Yeah, because I mean,
Well,
doing
'cause
something like the Iceman solo, like him reckoning with his gayness or something like that, I think would be something the students would really respond to. But like again, like in terms of
because a lot
classic
of the
essential stuff, yeah.
because we shied away from. I mean, looking at our comments, a lot of the listeners. I should actually mention real quick. Andrew had his recommendation. His big one was X-Men 253 through 255, which is the Battle for Mur Island. It's no main team members, and it is. I didn't go into it too much. It is a brilliant story where the lead character, such that it is Forge, who's the character from the Life Death story, and it covers a lot of the same ground that Excalibur does, which is what does it mean to be a mutant and to be an X-Man if you're not one of these primary characters who are normally if you're not Wolverine or Cyclops or Storm, or Jean Grey, what if you're Jamie Madrox, the Multiple Man? What if you're Strong Guy, Guido?
Yeah.
Those and
in terms of the franchising, Peter David answers some of those questions in his run of X Factor, which is really good. But we don't have time for it here.
Well, and I think that's the 21st century. Actually, it's late 90s when he starts. But those are some of those things that people could do a later project on. So I think that's not an entry course, but I think it does cover a pretty. I mean, we're taking a historical segment and sort of teaching different things. So dare I say it? Did we resolve something?
I think so.
I think we have a pretty good syllabus.
I mean, we resolved nothing because we don't do that on this show. But, but for an extra long episode, I think we have an interesting reading list. And what I was going to say before is what I think is great about it is when we asked for comments, a lot of the listeners, like one of the things that was recommended the most from on our call for comments was people were saying, whoa, I like the age of X, or I like the
Age of Apocalypse.
Age of Apocalypse, or and it's like, well, this is one of the things that happens is obviously the memory of a comic book fan is usually about 10 years long at most. The best stuff is always the last 10 years, and we didn't even get there. So I think that's interesting though, because probably people do know Apocalypse stuff fairly well, and I mean, no one was ever going to recommend Onslaught. It's garbage. But I mean, I don't think we need to teach a course. I mean, I think you could, but I think it's interesting to, particularly with this New Mutants movie that's never going to come out because Wayne cannot be allowed to win the box office game.
And if it comes out, I might win because it's the only movie that'll come out.
Yeah, but I do think it's interesting to look at a Demon Bear. Yeah, particularly with the artwork, which is amazing. Yeah. If people if you've learned nothing from this podcast, click on the link that's in the show notes to buy the Demon Bear saga from Amazon, because seriously, it's something you need to own.
Yeah,
I got it right here.
Well,
or better yet, in this age of pandemic, order it from your local comic shop because they need it.
Yes. Absolutely, yeah. Because they're opening next week, hopefully.
Yeah.
But yes. Hopefully we gave people a lot of stuff to read, a lot of stuff to think about. It was probably, I haven't, at recording time, it's been really long, but after editing, I don't know, this is going to be one of our longer episodes, but I think it was a good conversation. So, I do want to thank all of our guests for joining us. Since she had to leave, I will plug Caitlin's project. Her academic project is called Rescuing While Black, Unleashing Black Female Superheroes, and she has a website where she is charting the history of Black superheroes within the superhero genre, going back as long as it is, and or Black female superheroes specifically, though she talks about male ones as well. There aren't that many because of the other population of female superheroes and the other population of of Black superheroes. The intersection is not that great, but it is more than just Storm, and so she tries to sort of chart that and talk about that. And it's one of her academic projects that she's been working on for a while. So that will be linked in the show notes, as will Andrew Damon, who could could not be on with us because of technical difficulties. So we will link to the Claremont Run, his Twitter account, which has a lot of great analysis. I mean, seriously, he's great.
Yes.
It is responsible for getting me back into X-Men comics over the last 4 months, and I have been eternally grateful for that because I have needed that stress relief.
So we'll link to Andrew's thing, and I will link to frequent guest and friend of the show, Joe Dorowski. Has a book called X-Men and the Mutant Metaphor, Race and Gender in Comic Books, which is probably the definitive academic text published on the X-Men. And, we just couldn't get Joe to fit into the schedule this week. So otherwise he would have been here to pimp it himself. But definitely, if you're interested in an analysis of comics, specifically the X-Men, I would recommend his book. And then everybody else has one, so I'll let them go themselves. Anna, you're first because you're on the list. Where can people find you?
They can find me by Googling me. One of my X-Men articles is free on academia.edu if they look me up. I did something about representations of multiculturalism in Alpha Flight versus the X-Men, which is free for you to read. I also did something specifically about my love of Nightcrawler recently for the website Vault of Culture called Till Death Do We Part, my undying love affair with undying superheroes.
And that's a brilliant article because it is the perfect, and I mean this in the nicest possible way, it is the perfect marriage of academic analysis and utter fangirl gushery. Article that
honestly,
I've ever read.
Which is something we all aspire to.
Yes.
The piece was originally like a lot more about how sexy Nightcrawler is, and I toned that down a lot. Maybe this will be a bit more accessible, taking the angle that I did take.
Could you send us the first draft?
Well, that would be just my fan fiction, I think. I am also the co-host of 3-Panel Contrast, along with Andrew DeMann, who couldn't be with us. You can find that podcast wherever podcasts are found, and I have a book coming out. I'm an anthology that features a lot of X-Men content called Super Sex, Sexuality, Fantasy, and the Superhero, and it is available for pre-order now.
Okay.
Excellent.
All linked in the show notes. And Chris, what about you?
Probably my book that connects most to this topic would be Superhero Comics from Bloomsbury Press. I have a couple others, but I think that's going to be the one to link to and really fill in a lot of details around the things we've been talking about.
You also have a blog.
Yes, the Patron Saint of Superheroes. I blog every Monday there.
And we will link that in the show notes. Chris writes a lot of articles, so you are quite prolific.
Thank you.
So all of that linked in the show notes. Wayne, what about you?
Boy, I'm really feeling like a slacker today. I don't have any of that stuff.
You brought us that Paul Smith story, which made my day.
I have a lot of history. I should write more of it. This is the same old places. Nothing new this week.
Yeah, and you can follow me on Twitter at Chris Maverick or on my blog at chrismaverick.com. You can follow the show on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, all the places, always at Vox Popcast. You can follow the show's blog at www.voxpopcast.com, where we talk about whatever we're going to be talking about next week. And you can chime in. You can give us your thoughts. You can also give us our thoughts on shows that have aired, like this one. Let us know. What did you agree with? What have you read? What did we miss? Because I'm sure there's a lot, and people are going to be like, how did you not talk about the time that Kitty Pryde said, screw you, Professor X? And, which is funny. Or no, actually, I guess it's Professor X is a jerk, which is there's a brilliant poem in a collection of poetry that I have, superhero poetry, that just talks about the Professor X is a jerk moment. It's great. I'll send it to you guys. I actually teach it in one of my literature classes. But yeah, so we will let us know what your favorite X-Men stories are that we missed. Let us know if you took one of our recommendations and you read it and you're like, oh my God, Demon Bear is amazing, because it is, then let us know. And if you enjoy the show, and I certainly hope you do, because otherwise, why have you been here all this time? This was a long episode. Please subscribe to us on iTunes or Stitcher or Spotify or wherever the hell else you get podcasts from. And do us a favor, leave us a 5-star review on iTunes. That helps other people find the show. It makes us more popular. We can keep bringing content to you. And, hopefully we'll get sponsors one day so I can afford to go out and buy comics, which I hear they're going to start making again soon. So, I need that, very poor grad student. I would like to thank Maximilian of Thoughtform Music for our epic theme song, building ever so more epically and playing us out. I'd like to once again thank our guests for joining us and you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Oh yeah, Charles, we got ourselves an X-Men fan. You do know they're all bullshit, right? I mean, maybe a quarter of it happened. In the real world, people die.